The reading from the Hebrew Bible comes from the first book of Samuel, reading from chapter 15, beginning with verse 34. In his day, Samuel was the preeminent leader of Israel, the spiritual and political godfather, the elder statesman, the man for all seasons. Our text for today comes from the latter days of Samuel's life. Earlier in his career, the people had demanded a king. After much debate and soul-searching, Samuel chose and anointed Saul as the first king of Israel. The problem was Saul just didn't pan out to be the political and spiritual leader God and Israel needed. As our story begins, God tells Samuel to go and find a worthy successor to Saul. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gibeah of Saul. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul. And the Lord was sorry that he had made Saul king over Israel. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Hey, take a heifer with you and say, 'I've come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. You shall anoint for me the one whom I name to you." Samuel did as the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him, trembling, and said, "Do you come peaceably?" He said, "Peaceably. I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. He said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, but he's keeping the sheep." Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." He sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. The word of the Lord. Samuel knows what needs to be done, but he's reluctant to do it. Reluctant to give up on the king he had already chosen, reluctant to admit it was time to let go and go on. And so God says to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? How long will you grieve over Saul?" Now, grieving is part of life. We grieve for that which we lose: a person, a thing, a dream. We rightly mourn the death of a loved one. We are sad when a friend moves away. We are discouraged when a business deal goes sour. The breakup of a marriage, the death of a spouse, the loss of a job, the missing of some hoped-for opportunity, the failure of a favorite dream, all can lead us into what psychologists call episodic depression. We mourn because of something that happens to us, something we have lost. Such grief is a part of life, and such grief has its rightful place, but not forever. My father died just a few months before Ruthie and I were married. My newly widowed mother's visits were very difficult for those first few years. We were joyous newlyweds. And then my mother would crawl into town on the holidays and disperse sadness and despair at every turn. It was awful for her and for us. Then, as my mother used to tell it, one day she got up and came to the realization she had grieved long enough. It was time to put her grief behind her and to get on with her life. Grief has its place, but not forever. Your outlook on life shapes your life. Medical research has found that older patients who are optimistic live longer than those who are pessimistic. Turns out that thinking you are not going to recover from an illness can actually be a self-fulfilling prophecy. How long will you grieve for Saul, Samuel? It's time to let go and get on with your life and your work. But Samuel doesn't give in too easily. He protests to God, if Saul hears about this, he will kill me. You can't have two kings at the same time, A former colleague of mine speaks of the tendency to awfulize, to view the current situation in its worst light and then to elevate it from there, to imagine the most awful consequences possible for an action. Like Samuel to say, I could never do that, for surely Saul would try and kill me if he had the slightest idea what I'm up to. We can create all sorts of real and imaginary reasons for not doing what we need to do, what God calls us to do. Now, there's nothing irrational about being cautious in the face of real danger. What is irrational is fearing the unknown simply because it's unknown. In our story, God recognizes Samuel's fears and suggests an alternative strategy. Pretend you're going to make a sacrifice. Then Saul won't suspect you're on a trip to anoint a new king, which will signal that he's out. Well, sometimes it's better to go around an obstacle rather than trying to go over or through it. Sometimes we need to unlearn unproductive behaviors and move on to more productive, healthful responses to the crises of life. When Samuel finally arrives at Jesse's homestead, Jesse brings out his 7 oldest sons for Samuel's inspection. Samuel jumps on the first available candidate. He looks at the eldest son, Eliab, and thinks, surely this is God's anointed. Maybe in his head he was saying, hey, this guy looks exactly like his father. The only thing worse than running away from a problem is jumping at the first attractive solution. Eliab was a clone of Saul, tall, good-looking, firstborn son. Maybe Samuel was thinking, if at first you don't succeed, try again. I'll redeem myself this time. But that is not what God had in mind. God was not interested in a quick fix. God expected Samuel to make a reasoned and serious choice. The choice of a nation's lifetime. A choice among several very viable and attractive alternatives. A hard choice. And so it is with us too. The most significant choices that we make in life usually require us to discard some very good possibilities before making the best choice. And like Samuel's dilemma, sometimes such choices can be as painful as rejecting 7 fine sons before coming to that 8th one. For choosing any course results in not choosing others. Which leads us to the one memorable verse in this story. The Lord sees not as we see. We look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Samuel is advised not to choose too quickly, and further warned not to rely on surface features, but to look deeply into the person's heart, even as God does. We parents often badger our children to remember how important it is to make a good first impression. And it is important because too many people judge persons only on their first impression. Eliab made a good first impression, but not the right first impression for the work God needed to be done. For the full measure of a human being is one's character, not one's appearance. And first impressions are not always the best. A 19th century French schoolteacher wrote this about one of his students. Louis is the smallest, meekest, and least promising pupil in my class. The pupil was Louis Pasteur. Isaac Newton showed such little promise that his parents took him out of school and put him to work on a farm. Maybe that's where he saw that famous apple that fell from the tree. Young Albert Einstein was lucky to get a job as a clerk in the patent office after he wrote his PhD dissertation. First impressions are important, but they are not all there is. The Lord sees not as we see. We look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. One of the recurring themes of the Hebrew Bible is the idea that God's providence works quietly through all of human life. We rarely see the results of God's work in our world, but that doesn't mean God is not at work through the events of history to effect divine will. As the old hymn says, God moves in a mysterious way, His wonders to perform. I once served a congregation in southeast Missouri, in a small town on the banks of the Mississippi River. I came to appreciate the power and mystery of the mighty Mississippi, especially during the frequent and annual flood stages. The river is closely watched by the Army Corps of Engineers, who are constantly building and modifying levees in an effort to control its course. But despite all human effort, the Mississippi is slowly but surely changing its course. We might not see the results in our lifetime, but that doesn't mean the Father of the waters is not moving its channel. And so also the divine guidance of God is at work in our lives, even when we cannot see God's results. God is present and working with us and through us when we grieve. God is at work in our choices. God is at work in our lives whenever we let go and go on. Jesus develops and expands this Hebrew understanding of providence in his parables of the seed growing secretly and the mustard seed. In each parable, from very small beginnings and without any apparent human effort or understanding, a most marvelous result occurs. Not only is God at work in our lives, often in hidden or veiled ways, but the power of God in our lives is beyond comprehension. God is present in all of life and waiting for us to join her. As God worked through Samuel and David to further the kingdom, God works through us to extend the kingdom in our lives and world. Samuel finally was led to that youngest son of Jesse and directed to anoint David to be the next king of Israel. And the story ends with a triumphant word of promise. The Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. When we finally do act and make the right choices in our lives, God is with us in a mighty way. That powerful Spirit that came upon David comes upon all of those called to be God's children. And if we don't succeed in life, it isn't because God is not present with us. It may be because our dreams are too small, our hopes too faint, our efforts too weak, or our faith too irrelevant. If we have not found lasting joy and peace, it isn't because God doesn't care for us. It may be because we grieve too long for that which is lost and cannot be recovered. And if we have not found a lasting and meaningful place to stand, if we have found too little fulfillment in life, it isn't because God walked away from us. It may be because we have walked away from God. Dear friends, do not focus on outward appearances, but on the depth of character of the heart. Go and live within the providence of God. Let go and go on. And may the Spirit of the Lord come mightily upon you. Amen.